Dr. Richard Albright had been a cardiothoracic surgeon for 31 years when he walked onto the Family Feud stage in January 2022. And he made the mistake of his life in the third minute of the pre-game conversation. He looked at Steve Harvey, a man standing in a custom-tailored suit in a studio he had built, on a show he had run for 12 consecutive years, in front of 300 people who had traveled from across the country to see him, and said, with the particular confidence of a man who had never been wrong in a room before, "You know, Steve, I have to say, it's nice to meet a public entertainer. I don't get much culture time. My work keeps me in more serious circles." He smiled when he said it. The kind of smile that doesn't know it's a weapon. Steve Harvey heard every syllable. The studio went completely quiet. Steve looked at Dr. Albright for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then, he said one sentence. One sentence that made a 31-year veteran cardiac surgeon take a step backward, put both hands over his face, and begin to cry in front of 300 people and a national television audience. That sentence was, "Then let me introduce you to the serious man you've been talking to." It was January 2022, and Dr. Richard Albright had come to Atlanta with his wife Sandra, his son David, his daughter Patricia, and his son-in-law Greg. They were from Charlotte, North Carolina. Good family, by any measure. Sandra was a retired school principal. David taught architecture at UNC. Patricia did nonprofit work. Greg coached high school football. They were educated, accomplished people who had traveled a long way for what they expected to be an exciting afternoon. Dr. Albright was 64 years old. He was the kind of man who introduced himself by his title. He was the kind of man who had worked impossibly hard to earn that title. The son of a mill worker in Gastonia, North Carolina, who had studied through summers and scholarships and residencies that lasted longer than some marriages. He was also, in that particular way that some men develop when they have been the most credentialed person in every room they've inhabited for 3 decades, completely unaware of how he sounded to people outside those rooms. He hadn't meant it as an insult. That was the thing. He genuinely had not heard the words the way they landed. The studio, which had been warm and buzzing, went very still when he said it. Steve Harvey's hands went still. His smile, the working smile, the performance smile, disappeared. He placed his cards slowly on the podium. 3 seconds of silence that were quieter than silence usually is. And nobody in that studio knew that what came next would become one of the most replayed moments in the show's 30-year history. Steve Harvey grew up in the Woodland Hills housing projects in Cleveland, Ohio, the youngest of 5 children. His father, Harvey Broderick Harvey, worked at a steel mill. His mother, Eloise, worked wherever work could be found. Steve has spoken publicly about what it meant to be a black child in Glenville in the 60s and 70s. The assumptions made about what he was capable of, the ceilings placed over his head by people who had never asked what was inside it. He has also spoken about what happened when he was homeless from 1985 to 1988, 3 years sleeping in his 1976 Ford Tempo, showering in gas station bathrooms, performing comedy in clubs for door money that sometimes didn't cover his gas. During those 3 years, Steve was routinely dismissed by club owners who thought he was a novelty, by television executives who told him his style was too regional, by people in serious circles who had decided, without asking, that he wasn't serious. He had built everything he had against that assumption. Every network deal, every production company, every mentorship program, every book. The Steve Harvey Foundation, which had by 2022 provided college scholarships to over 14,000 young men. Every single thing Steve Harvey had been built in direct defiance of people who looked at him and saw just an entertainer. So when Dr. Richard Albright said what he said, Steve Harvey was not hearing it for the first time in his life. He was hearing it for the 10,000th time. And something shifted in the room. But the real story hadn't even started yet. Steve took one step toward Dr. Albright, not aggressive. Measured, he looked at the man the way you look at someone when you have decided to speak carefully because the words matter too much to waste. "Then let me introduce you to the serious man you've been talking to," Steve said. The studio fell completely silent. Dr. Albright blinked. His smile faded. He looked uncertain for the first time, the particular uncertainty of a man who has said something he cannot retrieve. "My name is Steve Harvey," Steve continued, and his voice had dropped into a register that was not the television voice. It was slower, more deliberate. "I grew up in the Woodland Hills projects in Cleveland, Ohio. I didn't have money for a school trip when I was 12 years old. I slept in my car for 3 years in my late 20s because I could not afford an apartment, and I refused to quit. I built this company from nothing. I have mentored more than 14,000 young men through my foundation who the world told were not serious. I have written books. I have built radio programs, television programs, production companies. I am a businessman. I am a producer. I am an employer. I have given people health care. I have given people careers." He paused. "I am all of those things every single day. And I put on a suit, and I come into this studio, and I also happen to make people laugh. Because laughter, sir, is serious work." Dr. Albright had taken a half step back. His wife Sandra was looking at the floor. "Now," Steve said, and his voice was still completely measured, still without anger, still simply true. "I want to offer you something. Because I don't think you meant what you said the way it landed. And that's the only reason we're still having this conversation." He stepped back and gave Dr. Albright the floor. The surgeon stood there for a moment. His jaw worked. His eyes were wet. Not from anything Steve had done to him, but from something he had just done to himself. The particular shame of a man who has hurt himself from the outside for the first time. "Mr. Harvey." "Doctor," Albright said, and his voice was different. The credential had come out of it. "I owe you an apology. I owe you a real one. What I said, the way I said it, I heard it just now listening to you, and I'm ashamed of it. I want you to know that I'm ashamed of it." The studio was quiet. Steve Harvey looked at him for a long moment. "I accept that," Steve said. And then, in a move that no one in that room predicted, "And I want to ask you something else. Do you have young black doctors coming up through your program?" Dr. Albright looked surprised. "We have a residency program, yes. How many of those residents are black?" "Silence, 2, Dr. Albright said quietly. "Out of 17. "That's where the serious work starts," Steve said. "Not in this studio, in yours." And then he did something no one expected. He extended his hand. Dr. Albright shook it. He was crying now, openly, without embarrassment, which was the most surprising thing of all about this man who had spent 31 years never being wrong in a room. He was crying the way people cry when something they didn't know was closed inside them finally opens. Sandra Albright, who had been standing 2 steps away with her hand over her mouth, said later in a post-show interview, "I watched my husband become a better man in 3 minutes. I've been trying to show him that for 30 years. It took Steve Harvey 1 sentence. Steve wasn't done. He stopped the taping after that exchange and gave both families the full prize package. He announced from the stage that he was donating $50,000 to a fellowship program specifically designed to fund Black medical residents, to be administered in partnership with HBCU medical programs, and that the fellowship would be announced within 60 days. A producer off stage had their head in their hands. Steve talked right over it. "This has never happened in the show's 30-year history," Steve said to the room. "But neither has today." He looked at Dr. Albright one final time. "You're a man who saves lives," Steve said. "Don't save them selectively." The episode aired 6 weeks after the taping. The clip of Steve's one-sentence response, "Then let me introduce you to the serious man you've been talking to," was viewed 310 million times in the first 3 weeks. It was translated into 19 languages. The hashtag Serious Man trended globally for 4 consecutive days. Every major news network covered it. Late-night hosts discussed it. University professors assigned it. It was included in at least 3 diversity training curricula that were updated within the following year. Dr. Richard Albright gave a public statement 10 days after the episode aired. In it, he acknowledged what he had said and what it had revealed about his own blind spots. He also announced that Charlotte Medical Center, the hospital where he was chief of cardiothoracic surgery, was implementing a new minority recruitment initiative for its residency program. The goal was to reach 35% Black and Latino residents within 4 years. He credited the conversation on the stage of Family Feud as the catalyst. 3 months after that day, Steve Harvey and Dr. Albright appeared together at a medical education conference in Atlanta. Steve spoke about mentorship. Albright spoke about the pipeline failures in medicine that he had spent 31 years not noticing. Afterward, they had dinner. They have spoken several times since. A year after the taping, the Harvey Albright Medical Fellowship funded its first 8 Black surgical residents, 4 at Howard University Hospital, 4 at Meharry Medical College. Each fellowship included full stipend support, mentorship access, and a network of 200 Black physicians who had committed to guiding the next generation. Today, 2 of those first 8 fellows are completing their first year of practice. One of them is a cardiothoracic surgeon. Steve Harvey, in an interview reflecting on the episode, said, "I wasn't angry at that man. I want to be clear about that. I was tired. I've been tired since I was 12 years old of being seen as less than what I am. But I also know that the men who taught me the worst lessons were sometimes the men who grew the most when they were shown something different." That doctor, he heard himself that day. And when a man hears himself for the first time and chooses to change, that's not a failure. That's a beginning. He paused. The sentence I said to him wasn't an attack. It was an introduction. I was introducing him to me. Finally, after 31 years of him walking past people like me without seeing us, there is a specific kind of courage that looks like stillness, that doesn't raise its voice, doesn't need to prove its anger, simply stands where it stands and tells the truth about who it is. Steve Harvey has been standing in that stillness his whole life. Most people just hadn't been paying attention. That day in January 2022, one more person started paying attention. If this moment, and the one sentence that changed everything, moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that dignity is not given to you by the rooms you're allowed into. It is what you carry into every room. Have you ever had to introduce yourself to someone who had already decided who you were? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell, because as Steve Harvey proved, sometimes the most important thing you can say is simply the truth of who you are.